everybody, this is Dr. Maples. You may have noticed that the weather outside is changing. Sure is looking like fall. I think it'd be a great time to put on your favorite hiking sweatshirt and go for a little walk in the woods. And while we're doing that, why don't we visit the Sheltowee Trace? What's the Sheltowee Trace? Well, it's this amazing multi-use trail that we're very fortunate to have right here in eastern Kentucky. And in fact, today I'd like to share with you some of the research that I've done on the Sheltowee Trace. Now, this research is forthcoming in the journal Shape, and I'll put links to that in the description below once that's available. I've also got a full version of this report that's available on my Division for Regional Economic Assessment and Modeling website, and you can look at that in the description below. I do appreciate if you like and subscribe to this channel. It always makes me feel good to see a couple extra subscribers and a couple extra likes when I get up in the morning. Now, I do want to thank a couple of folks for supporting this study. First off, thanks to the Sheltowee Trace Association for helping us get this survey out. Likewise, thanks to our Trail Town colleagues for helping to make sure this research was out there and the survey was available. And more importantly, just sharing the news about this amazing trail. Thanks also to Eastern Kentucky University for providing a grant to support this study. Now, for those of you who haven't already picked it up, I would love it if you go check out my book on the history of the Red River Gorge rock climbing community. Now, the Red River Gorge links up with the Sheltowee Trace. In fact, Slade, the town well known with the Red River Gorge, is one of the trail towns that we'll talk about in this study. If you haven't checked out this book, I think it's pretty awesome, and that's what everybody's telling me, so hopefully it's really good. Anyways, that's available on Amazon. You can pick that up today. You can also go to the West Virginia University Press website and find it there. All right, we got a lot of cool things to talk about today, so let's get started. First things first, what is the Sheltowee Trace? Well, the Sheltowee is this 333-mile and growing multi-use trail that's right here in eastern Kentucky. Now, it starts in the Big South Fork across the state line in Tennessee. It then goes across the state line and goes all the way north through much of the Daniel Boone National Forest into Rowan County, kind of near Morehead State. In fact, Morehead's also one of those cool trail towns we'll talk about today. Trail towns are exciting because they're such an important part of making sure that people know a trail exists and that they can get onto that trail and actually access these areas. And likewise, Sheltowee's trail towns are very important to think about in terms of the expenditures that happen as a result of the trail. Now, much of the trail is hiking in the woods, so you won't be spending money. But when you get on and off the trail, those are very likely moments where you're contributing to eastern Kentucky's growing outdoor recreation economy. Looking into this study, we really came up with three central questions. First off, we wanted to know why visitors chose the Sheltowee Trace. Of all the things that are happening in eastern Kentucky, and even our region of central Appalachia, why the Sheltowee? We wanted to see also what kind of activities they were getting into while they were here. Second, we wanted to know more about these trail town expenditure patterns. Typically, if a person visits the Sheltowee, what can we expect them to spend right here in the state of Kentucky, near our trail towns? Finally, we wanted to spend a little bit more time understanding exactly who these people are that are visiting the Sheltowee Trace. So first off, for data collection, we did an online survey in 2020. We had 418 people respond to the survey, and 383 of these cases were usable responses. The rest were, clicks on the survey link, but they maybe only filled out one or even no questions. The 383 filled out at least a third of the study, and for every case where they maybe left the study a little early, we included their answers right up to the moment that they left. Now, this is a convenience sample, and that's not a bad thing. First off, there's a couple of reasons for that. We don't know the population of people that use the Sheltowee. In chatting with the Daniel Boone National Forest, there's no specific count of people using the Sheltowee in a particular year. So that's the first part. And second, we don't know who all got access to the survey because it's an online survey. So we treat this as a convenience sample, but that's still a very common thing for studies of this kind. Now, we looked at a couple of variables, and you'll see these variables in more detail a little later in our talk, but we looked at use patterns, we looked at expenditure patterns and things like lodging, food, travel, and retail purchases, and then we also looked at some common demographics. We'll go through each of these variables as we get to them in the study. Now, first off, we wanted to know why people were visiting the Sheltowee. First off, 73% of the people visited the Sheltowee in 2020. Some of them visited in previous years. For our expending categories in the coming up slides, we only focused on people who visited that particular year. But for the rest of these categories, if you'd visited the Sheltowee in the last couple of years, we included your responses. Why were people visiting the Sheltowee? Well, most of it was hiking related. They listed hiking, they listed backpacking, through hiking as the main things. There were several categories that got 1 and 2% area, things like horseback riding, OHV use, paddling, and mountain biking. And these are all things too that relate to the Sheltowee. Some other responses were things like fishing, climbing, and more. Now, I will say the result on this may actually be a little bit skewed. By going through the Sheltowee Trace Association, we may have inadvertently got more hikers responding to the survey than we anticipated. So do keep that in mind. I personally think the Sheltowee Trace is used for a lot of reasons, but this particular table, it might actually describe more what the hiking end of the Sheltowee looks like. Next, what were the group sizes like? Well, it was about 2 people for the most part. Generally, people were either hiking or visiting the area alone, or they were doing it in groups of 2. There were larger groups, but the mean size was 2.2 persons, and the bulk of the sample really was 1 or 2 people on that visit. How long did they visit? Well, we found that 2.19 days was the average day length, and 2 nights was the most common. And most generally, all the results were between 0 and 10 days. Now, we do want to talk a little bit about the expenditure patterns for people visiting the Sheltowee, and I do want to mention a couple of methodological things. First off, I've already mentioned that this only looks at people who visited the Sheltowee in 2020. Some of you may be thinking, it feels like there was a historic event that happened that year. Oh, there was a pandemic. Yeah, that actually may have impacted the use patterns a little bit. So keep that in mind as we go through these results. Secondly, we limited the expenditures to people who didn't live in any of the trail towns or their immediate surrounding area. We wanted people who live outside the region who are coming here and bringing in new money to be what we study in terms of visitor expenditures. Why is that? Well, local residents spend lots of money because of the Sheltowee, but they live here, so they're actually not considered, per economic study methodology, new expenditures. They're considered to already be in the economy. What we want to focus on is people coming from, say, Ohio, who are coming to this area to visit, maybe for the weekend, and leaving behind money as a result of it. We also looked too at the expenditure patterns in terms of thinking of them as a sort of a normal, typical trip. If a typical visitor comes to the Sheltowee and visits for that average of 2.2 days, these are kind of what the expenditure patterns look like per person on a very typical average trip. We also split up the expenditures in 2 ways. We looked at them in terms of in the trail towns and then outside of the trail towns, but still in the state of Kentucky, to try and understand when and where people are spending money. We did not have a large enough sample on this study to be able to pinpoint specific trail towns, but I will say I think that would be something to do in repeating this study in the future year when there's, not a pandemic going on. Now, what did we find? If we look at the expenditure patterns, we actually see some really cool things. First off, with the lodging, we always have to keep in mind there's lots of free lodging on the Sheltowee, and that you get a camping or you get a overnight permit, then you can camp for free in all these backcountry sites. So we only are listing in this top part of the table here people who actually spent more than $1 on their lodging. That lets us know that they actually spent money. And when they spend money, they're actually spending a fair amount, about $76 on hotels, about $16 on camping, usually in private campgrounds, and generally about $200 renting cabins, renting houses, and so forth. Beyond that, when we think about average expenditures for everyone, and this includes 0 expenditures where they didn't spend anything, people spent about $8 on gas as a result of their trip, and about $6 per person on fast food. There was, dine-in food. There was some fast food expenditures of about $3.50. We've got convenience food, which is getting like an Ale-8 at the gas station of $2. But generally speaking, gas and dine-in food were the big common expenditures. And that's actually what we see in most studies of this kind. Those are just the areas that people like to spend money the most. Now, this is inside the study area, so this looks at all the trail towns inclusively and thinks about the expenditures in the trail town areas. When we get outside the trail towns to places, say, like Lexington, we also have a little bit of information. When people get outside the trail towns, but they're still in the state of Kentucky, we first off see the lodging go up substantially. We see the hotel expenditures go up to about $200 a person, camping to $118, and I'm guessing that's probably because of RV camping. And third, on the cabins, we see that go up to about $375. As a result of driving into the Sheltowee to get, here and recreate in this area, people were spending about close to $10 on gasoline per person. The rest of the expenditures were fairly low, except for recreation retail. Here it probably tells us that people are stopping for gas in places like Lexington, and they're probably staying the night in places like Lexington, but generally they're focusing their expenditures inside the trail towns. And that's what we want to see. We want expenditures to be focused in our trail towns so that it supports the Sheltowee Trace the best. I will point out that rec retail number though, 757, that tells us that a lot of people were probably stopping at a store in Lexington, or maybe even at like a Walmart and going to their outdoor recreation areas to buy gear. And that's something, if we could work that into the trail towns in the future, that would be a really useful thing for the local economy. Now, when we look at the demographics, they're actually not all that surprising. They, again, sort of show what we see in other studies of this type. Respondents were close to 50-50, male and female. The 40 to 64 category was about half the folks. And then finally 65 and older, 33%. We also saw some really cool things in terms of education, and they're basically split about a third when it comes to going less than a bachelor's degree, or graduate studies. And when we split them up by income categories, we see that about 60% of the people had less than $75,000 in personal income, and about close to 40% had $75,000 or more as their personal income. So this kind of shows that what we've seen in other places. Outdoor recreation users are typically well educated, and they typically have higher incomes because of the education, and that unlocks cool jobs. So this is a really cool demographic, but it's not surprising. It's what we've seen in other studies, particularly my work in the Red River Gorge on the rock climbing community there. So a couple of points that we want to consider about this study. First off, the results of this show that visitors to the Sheltowee area are spending a lot of great money here. They're spending money in the trail towns. But what I think that we need to do is first off get some better visitation estimates for this area. Having a larger study that would support having some trail work where we can count people going in and out of the trailheads would be really valuable, but also help us get a much larger sample for this study. I think too that would also be key for us to move from taking this as an economic expenditure study and move it to the realm of an economic impact study where we can genuinely measure how the expenditures impact things like taxes, jobs, and more. Second, I think that we should look at some ways to join together our trail towns. They all seem to be sort of on their own in that sense. Even though the Trail Town program is something that's supported by the state of Kentucky, they all seem to do things on their own. And I think working together to advertise the Sheltowee, likewise providing a list of like where you can get off the trail and get supplies, would be really helpful to the people using this trail. I think also too that would likely help to increase the expenditures in the area and even hopefully pull some of those expenditures away from larger metro areas like Lexington and bring them right into our local trail towns. I also think too that the visitation, it's kind of tricky on this one. We don't understand how the pandemic and COVID has really impacted outdoor recreation areas. Some areas closures caused, visitation to plummet. In other cases, and I think this is the story for the Red River Gorge, we actually saw visitation rates increase because people needed to get out of the house, but they couldn't be in public spaces, so they went into the backcountry to try and get away from this pandemic, which we still don't fully understand. So we don't know exactly how this impacted the area, and I think more research on that would be really useful. We need to understand those negative impacts of reduced visitation, reduced spending, and more to really get a grip on the Sheltowee Trace. And I think also, too, we need more organizations to partner with public lands on this. I applaud the Sheltowee Trace Association for working with the Daniel Boone National Forest to make sure that we have information about this trail, but also to get people to practice leave no trace ethics. So make sure when you're visiting the Sheltowee to limit your impacts. We also want to make sure, though, that local organizations can help get that information to their users. And frankly, also just help support things like trail cleaning, trail building, and more for the Daniel Boone National Forest. The Sheltowee Trace is such an amazing resource, and we're really lucky to have it going through Eastern Kentucky. I also have to say, too, it's an amazing outdoor recreation experience. You can get into some very remote areas here and truly feel what Kentucky looks like when we get out of the cities and towns. It's an amazing experience, and I'll wholeheartedly encourage you to do some research on the Sheltowee Trace, pick up a guidebook, some maps, make sure you don't get lost out there because it can be kind of remote. Watch out for the copperheads, and just enjoy this amazing experience. Thanks for watching this video. If there's research you'd like me to do in the future, drop me a line. I'd be happy to talk about it. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.